The envelope landed on my desk at 4:47 p.m. on a Friday with the weight of a death sentence and the thickness of a grocery store receipt. I knew what it was before I opened it. Nothing good comes in thin envelopes on Friday afternoons. Thick envelopes contain severance packages with checks and legal documents and apologetic language about difficult business decisions. Thin envelopes contain exactly two things: a letter explaining why you're screwed, and documentation proving they planned it all along. I opened it standing next to the copier that had been jamming since March, the one nobody bothered fixing because why spend money on equipment when you're spending it on executive golf trips instead? Inside was a letter on cream-colored company letterhead and a severance agreement with a number that made my hands shake: $0. Not 0,000. Not even 0,100. Just a cold, precise zero with 2 decimal points, like they'd calculated my worth down to the exact cent and landed on absolutely nothing. 14 years, 2 months, and 17 days. That's how long I'd worked at Vanguard Tech Solutions. That's 5,195 days of arriving before anyone else, leaving after everyone gone home, answering crisis calls at 2:37 a.m. because the quarterly report was due and someone forgot to reconcile the subsidiary accounts. 5,195 days of missing my nephew's baseball games, skipping family dinners, and explaining to my sister why I couldn't take a real vacation because third quarter was always chaotic and someone needed to be there to hold the team together. And Richard Cosgrove, our new CFO with his $1,000 suits and his smile that looked like it had been focus grouped by sociopaths, had determined that all of it was worth exactly $0.00. I'm Diane Foster, and I wasn't supposed to be the person who fought back. I was supposed to be the quiet one, the competent one, the woman who kept her head down and her files organized and never made waves because that's how you survive in corporate America when you're 52 and female and not interested in playing political games. I drove a 2014 Subaru Outback with 203,000 miles on it and a coffee stain on the passenger seat that had been there so long it had achieved permanent status. I took my vacation days at my sister's lake house in Pennsylvania, the one with the screened porch that needed rescreening and the boat motor that only worked if you cursed at it in exactly the right tone. I wasn't fancy. I wasn't flashy. But I knew every financial procedure, every policy exception, every line item in every budget, and exactly which executives were violating company policy while laying off employees to control costs. And I'd been documenting every single violation for 8 months, 23 days, and approximately 6 hours. But let me back up to January 12th at 9:15 a.m., when Richard Cosgrove walked into Vanguard Tech Solutions like a villain from a movie about corporate raiders and ethical bankruptcy. He came from a private equity firm called Blackstone Capital Partners, which in normal language means he specialized in buying companies, stripping out anything valuable, and selling the corpse to the highest bidder. He had slicked back hair that looked like it had been applied with a trowel, wore cufflinks that probably cost more than my car, and had this habit of checking his Apple Watch mid-conversation like your words had a time limit and he was tracking your inefficiency in real time. His first official act was to call an all-hands meeting in the main conference room, the one that smelled like old coffee and broken dreams, with the thermostat that had been stuck at 64 degrees since 2019. He stood at the front of the room with a PowerPoint presentation titled Fiscal Accountability and Operational Excellence, which should have been everyone's first warning that things were about to get catastrophically bad. We need to examine every expense, he announced, clicking to a slide covered in charts that were color-coded to suggest urgency. Every position must demonstrate quantifiable return on investment. Every department must justify its existence through measurable metrics. We're going to run this organization like a business, not like a social club. I sat in the back row next to Margaret from HR, who whispered, "Oh God, here we go again." She'd been through 4 CFO transitions. She knew the script. What she didn't know was that Richard wasn't following the normal script. He was writing a new one, and it involved destroying people's careers while enriching his own in ways that violated every policy we had. The layoff started on January 31st. First wave, administrative support staff. Receptionists, coordinators, the woman who'd been managing our employee wellness program for 7 years. 12 people gone in one day. Their severance packages were calculated at 2 weeks per year of service, plus continuation of benefits for 3 months, plus outplacement support. Standard company policy, exactly as written in our employee handbook. Second wave came on February 28, middle management. Project coordinators, department supervisors, the guy who'd been running our IT help desk for 9 years and knew where every digital skeleton was buried. 19 people gone. Their severance packages, 1 week per year of service, benefits for 2 months, no outplacement support. Not standard policy. A deviation. A cost-saving measure that Richard had approved without board oversight. I flagged it in my quarterly report to Morrison & Associates, the external audit firm that reviewed our financial controls. Just a note, professionally worded, severance calculations for Q1 departures deviated from documented company policy. Recommend clarification of current policy standards for future consistency. Now, before this story gets even more satisfying, let me hit you with a reality check. About 89% of you are listening to this while pretending to work, and you haven't hit subscribe yet. That's like eating someone's homemade lasagna at a potluck and then leaving without even saying thank you. Hit that subscribe button right now. Think of it as karma insurance, because what happens to Richard and his executive buddies next is absolutely worth the price of admission. By March, I'd noticed something interesting in the executive expense reports that crossed my desk every month. My job as Director of Financial Operations wasn't just managing budgets, it was reviewing and approving all expense reimbursements over $5,000. Every executive charged their corporate cards for business expenses, then submitted documentation for reimbursement. My job was to verify that the expenses were legitimate business necessities according to our written policy. Richard's first expense report landed on my desk on March 3 at 2:17 p.m. Request for reimbursement, $14,750. Category, Client Development and Business Entertainment. Supporting documentation, 1 receipt from Morton's Steakhouse showing dinner for 8 people with a pre-tip total of $11,000 and a tip of $2,200. The tip alone was $2,200. For 8 people. That's either the best service in human history or an executive flexing on the company dime. I pulled up our CRM system and checked the date, March 1st. No client meetings scheduled. No active prospects in town. No documented business purpose for an $11,000 dinner. Just 8 executives celebrating something, charging it to the company, and calling it client development. I flagged it. Professional, neutral, documented, expense reimbursement request for $14,750 lacks supporting documentation of business necessity as required by Company Policy Section 4.2. Recommend additional documentation showing client attendance or business purpose before approval. Richard approved it anyway. Overrode my flag. Added a note in the system, executive discretion. Business purpose confirmed. Process reimbursement immediately. That wasn't how policy worked. But Richard was CFO, and I was just the person who read policies and thought they mattered. The expenses kept coming. March 17, $8,300 for leadership development and team building. The receipt showed a weekend golf outing at Scottsdale National Golf Club in Arizona. The attendee list, 5 executives. No team to develop. No employees to build. Just 5 people playing golf at a club where membership cost $450,000 and the greens fees were $500 per person per round. I flagged it. Richard overrode it. Approved reimbursement. March 29, $6,100 for strategic planning session. The receipt, private room at a restaurant with a $3,200 wine bill. For 4 people. That's $800 per person in wine alone, not counting the food. I flagged it. Richard overrode it. April 12, $12,400 for vendor relationship management. The receipt, tickets to a playoff basketball game, courtside seats, including $4,000 in hospitality expenses that appeared to be bottle service at a nightclub afterward. I flagged every single one. And Richard overrode every single flag. By May 1st, I'd identified $127,000 in executive expenses that violated company policy. Not illegal necessarily, just violations of our documented written policy that required business necessity and proper documentation. The same policy Richard was using to justify laying off employees because we needed to control costs and operate more efficiently. The third wave of layoffs hit on April 30th, 23 people gone. Severance packages, flat $5,000 per person, regardless of years of service. No benefits continuation. No outplacement support. One guy who'd been there 19 years got the same $5,000 as someone who'd been there 2 years. I flagged that too, in my quarterly report to Morrison and Associates. Severance calculations continue to deviate from documented company policy without board authorization. Q1, Q2 workforce reductions have eliminated 54 positions while executive discretionary spending has increased by 340% compared to prior year same period. Recommend policy review and clarification. Sarah Chen from Morrison and Associates called me on May 3 at 3:47 p.m. Sarah was the senior audit partner I'd worked with for 9 years. We'd been through 3 major acquisitions, 2 restructurings, and 1 fraud investigation together. She knew my work. She trusted my documentation. And she could read between the lines better than anyone I'd ever met. "Diane," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant she'd found something troubling in the numbers. "I'm seeing patterns in your quarterly reports that concern me. Significant executive spending increases during workforce reductions, policy deviations without board documentation, severance calculations that don't match written policy. Is there context I should understand?" "Richard is restructuring operations," I said carefully, aware that I was on a recorded line. "Stated objective is reducing overhead costs and improving operational margins." Long pause. Sarah had been auditing companies for 26 years. She could detect bullshit through 3 layers of corporate spin and a soundproofed wall. "I see. And these executive expenses, they're being approved during the same period as these workforce reductions?" "Correct. That's an interesting allocation of resources. I thought you might find it notable." "Diane, I'm going to be direct. The audit committee is going to have questions about this pattern. Are you under any pressure to alter documentation or overlook policy violations?" "No," I said honestly. "I document everything according to policy. I always have." "Good. Keep doing exactly that. And Diane? Document everything related to your own employment situation as well. Just as a precaution." That conversation happened on May 3rd. On May 8th at 4:30 p.m., Richard called me into his office. His office was on the executive floor, which was decorated like a law firm in a movie about rich people doing crimes. Dark wood paneling, leather furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the city skyline. Richard sat behind his massive desk like a judge presiding over a sentencing hearing. "Diane," he said, not bothering with pleasantries or small talk. "I've been reviewing organizational structure and operational efficiency. I think we need to discuss your role and your future with the company." I sat in the chair across from his desk, a leather monstrosity that made small squeaking noises every time I moved and cost approximately $3,000 according to the expense report I'd approved last quarter. "I'm listening. Your role has been valuable historically," he said, using past tense like a weapon, "but we're moving toward automated financial management systems. New software that can handle most of your current functions. It's not personal. It's about efficiency and cost optimization." "I understand. What's your timeline for this transition?" "We'd like you to stay through end of June to assist with implementation and knowledge transfer. Then we'll be restructuring your position." Restructuring. Not eliminating. Not ending. Restructuring. As if the job would still exist, just without me in it. As if I was the problem, not the essential component. "And severance?" I asked. He smiled. That smile that never touched his eyes and looked like it had been practiced in a mirror until it achieved the perfect blend of sympathy and total insincerity. "We'll discuss that closer to your departure date. Standard company policy, naturally." Standard company policy for someone with 14 years of service was 2 weeks per year. 28 weeks of salary. Roughly 7 months of pay. Enough to survive while finding new employment. That meeting happened on May 8th at 4:30 p.m. On May 9th at 10 a.m., I had my regular quarterly check-in call with Sarah Chin. The audit committee has questions, she said without preamble. Specifically about executive expense patterns during workforce reductions. About business justification for discretionary expenditures that appear to violate documented policy. About whether the board is aware of these spending patterns and whether they align with stated financial objectives. What kind of questions? I asked. Questions about fiduciary responsibility. About policy compliance. About optics. About whether expenses totaling nearly $350,000 in discretionary spending can be justified during a period when the company is laying off 54 employees to control costs. I see. Diane, I need you to keep documenting exactly as you have been. Every expense, every policy deviation, every severance calculation. Can you do that? I always do. Good. And Diane? Whatever happens with your employment situation, make sure you document everything. Every conversation, every email, every meeting. Understood? Understood. I spent the next 7 weeks training my replacement. His name was Kevin Bradshaw, and he was 24 years old with an accounting degree from a state school and the financial sophistication of someone who thought QuickBooks was advanced technology. Nice kid. Absolutely catastrophically unprepared for this job. He kept asking questions like, do we really need receipts for everything? And, what's a general ledger? And, why do we have to review every expense when we have software that can just auto-approve them? I documented every training session. Every question he asked. Every concept he didn't understand. Every procedure I explained that he nodded along. To wit, the blank expression of someone who was retaining approximately nothing. I created transition documents so detailed they could have been used as evidence in court. Which, as it turned out, was exactly what they'd become. June 28, 3:45 p.m. Richard called me back to his office. This time Janet from HR was there, clutching a folder and wearing the expression of someone who was about to deliver terrible news while following a legal script. Diane, we want to thank you for your service, Richard began, sliding a folder across his desk like he was dealing cards at a poker table. We've prepared your severance documentation for your review and signature. I opened the folder. Inside was a severance agreement. The calculation section showed, years of service, 14.2. Severance calculation, $0. Classification, voluntary resignation in lieu of termination for cause. I read it 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding something. This says termination for cause. What's the documented cause? Performance issues, Richard said vaguely, waving his hand like he was swatting away an insect. Failure to adapt to new systems, resistance to necessary organizational changes, concerns about judgment and professional discretion. It's all documented in your personnel file. It was absolutely not documented anywhere. I'd received 0 performance reviews indicating problems. 0 written warnings. 0 documented counseling sessions. 0 anything except excellent performance reviews and 1 email from Richard saying my excessive attention to policy details was slowing down business processes. I'd like to see this documentation, I said. Janet will provide copies, Richard replied. We need you to sign the severance agreement by end of business tomorrow. That gives you adequate time to review and consult with anyone you'd like. And if I don't sign? His smile got wider, which made it somehow less friendly. Then we proceed with formal termination for cause, which becomes part of your permanent employment record. That might create challenges for future employment opportunities. Background checks can be very thorough these days. I left his office with the unsigned agreement and walked directly to my car. Didn't pack my desk. Didn't say goodbye to anyone. Just walked to my Subaru in the parking garage, got in, and sat there for 10 minutes staring at the concrete wall. Then I did 3 things. First, I called Margaret Wu, an employment attorney my sister had used during her divorce. Margaret had a reputation for making HR departments nervous and corporate lawyers reconsider their life choices. I explained the situation while sitting in my car, and her response was immediate and blunt: "Don't sign anything. They're trying to intimidate you into waiving your rights based on fake documentation that won't hold up under scrutiny. Let them terminate you if they want. Then we'll see how their performance issues argument looks when we request their supporting evidence through discovery." Second, I emailed Sarah Chen at Morrison & Associates with the subject line, "Urgent, employment situation update, potential policy violations." I attached a copy of the severance agreement and a timeline of events. Third, I forwarded myself copies of every executive expense report, every policy deviation flag I'd submitted, every compliance issue I'd documented over the past 6 months. I sent them to my personal email in batches small enough that they wouldn't trigger IT monitoring alerts. Every receipt showing policy violations. Every expense report Richard had overridden. Every severance calculation that deviated from written policy. By the time I drove home, I had a complete archive of everything I'd need. June 30th, 4:47 p.m. The thin envelope arrived via interoffice mail with my official termination letter. Employment status: terminated for cause. Severance amount: $0. Final paycheck, attached, minus 2 weeks of accrued vacation that had somehow been forfeit due to termination classification. They'd even stolen my vacation pay. 2 weeks I'd earned and never taken because I was always too busy fixing their messes and covering their mistakes. I didn't sign the agreement. Instead, I sent a formal written response declining to sign and requesting copies of all documented performance issues, warnings, and policy violations that supported the termination for cause classification. July 3rd, 9:17 a.m. Email from Janet in HR: "Your employment with Vanguard Tech Solutions ended June 30th. Your system access has been terminated and your badge has been deactivated. We consider this matter closed. Do not contact current employees or return to company property without authorization." They considered it closed. I considered it just beginning. July 5th, 10:30 a.m. Sarah Chen called my cell phone. "Diane, I need to inform you that Morrison & Associates is conducting an expanded audit of Vanguard Tech Solutions. Specifically examining executive expense compliance, severance calculation policies, and adherence to documented company procedures. This investigation was requested by the audit committee based on patterns identified in our quarterly review process." "What's the timeline?" I asked. "Standard investigations take 8 to 12 weeks. But Diane, the board was extremely interested in certain patterns we identified. Particularly the correlation between workforce reductions and executive expense increases, and the systematic deviation from written severance policies. They've requested a comprehensive forensic review." The audit began on July 10th. Morrison & Associates sent a formal request to Vanguard demanding comprehensive documentation, all executive expense reports over $5,000 for the past 18 months, copies of written company policies regarding expenses and severance, documentation supporting all expense approvals, and complete records of all employee terminations including severance calculations. Richard had to provide everything. Every receipt for every dinner. Every golf trip. Every bottle of wine. Every basketball game. And sitting next to each expense in the audit file was my quarterly compliance report showing exactly which expenses violated policy and exactly which of my flags Richard had overridden. By August 1st, the preliminary findings were devastating. Over the same 18-month period that Vanguard had laid off 93 employees citing cost control, the executive team had spent $847,000 in discretionary expenses. Of that amount, approximately $392,000 violated written company policy regarding business necessity, documentation requirements, or approval procedures. During that same period, they'd progressively reduced severance packages from standard policy calculations, saving approximately $340,000 by paying people less than policy required. The largest single deviation, my severance, which should have been $156,000 based on 14 years of service, calculated instead at $0 based on fake performance issues. The audit report presented to the board on August 15 included specific findings. Executive management has systematically violated documented company policy regarding expense approval and business necessity requirements. During the same period, severance calculations have deviated from written policy without board authorization, resulting in significant cost savings achieved through policy violations. The timing correlation between workforce reductions justified by cost control and executive expense increases totaling $847,000 raises serious questions about fiduciary responsibility and leadership judgment. Recommendation: management should immediately reimburse the company for all policy-violating expenses. All severance calculations should be reviewed and recalculated according to written policy. The board should consider whether executive compensation, including performance bonuses, should be adjusted to reflect compliance failures and the financial impact of improper severance calculations. The board meeting happened on August 19 at 2 p.m. I wasn't there, but Sarah called me at 4:23 p.m. with the results. The board voted unanimously to require full reimbursement of all policy-violating expenses, she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. They're withholding the entire executive bonus pool pending complete review of compensation practices and policy compliance. And Diane, they specifically asked about your severance situation. What did you tell them? I told them your termination was classified as for cause with zero supporting documentation, that your severance calculation violated written company policy for long-term employees, and that your departure coincided suspiciously with our investigation into executive expense compliance. I also mentioned that you'd been the primary compliance liaison with our audit team for 9 years and that you'd consistently flagged the very policy violations we discovered. What happens now? Now the board's outside counsel will contact you. They're very motivated to resolve this appropriately. The call came on August 22 from Patricia Montgomery, a lawyer representing Vanguard's board of directors independently from company management. Ms. Foster, the board has reviewed the circumstances surrounding your termination and the associated severance calculation. We believe significant errors were made in how your departure was handled. We'd like to discuss an appropriate resolution. The resolution, presented to me on August 30, was comprehensive, full severance package calculated according to written company policy, 28 weeks of salary totaling $156,000. Back payment of 2 weeks accrued vacation that had been improperly withheld, $11,200. Formal letter for employment records stating that departure was voluntary resignation in good standing with no performance issues. Confidential settlement payment compensating for emotional distress and improper severance calculation, $125,000. Total settlement, $292,200. Not coincidentally, $125,000 was exactly what Richard Cosgrove would have received as his annual performance bonus. Would have received. Past tense. I signed the settlement agreement on September 1 in Patricia Montgomery's office with Margaret Wu sitting beside me reviewing every clause. The money hit my bank account on September 5 at 2:17 p.m. I watched the balance update on my phone and felt something I hadn't felt in 14 years, freedom. On September 6, Vanguard issued a brief press release. CFO Richard Cosgrove has decided to pursue opportunities outside the organization. We thank him for his service and wish him well in future endeavors. Translation: fired, escorted out by security, bonus forfeited, reputation destroyed. On September 15, Vanguard announced new policies. All executive expenses over $1,000 required approval by an independent board oversight committee, all severance calculations required board review and compliance certification, and all financial compliance flags required written explanation before override. In October, Sarah Chin called me. We need someone who understands the difference between written policy and actual practice. Someone who isn't afraid to document gaps and hold people accountable. Interested in joining Morrison & Associates as a senior financial compliance analyst? I've been there 2 years now. My job is reviewing corporate financial documentation and identifying discrepancies between stated policies and actual practices. I look for patterns: excessive executive spending during workforce reductions, severance calculations that mysteriously shrink over time, expense approvals that violate written policy, documentation gaps that suggest intentional oversight. I'm exceptionally good at this job. Possibly because I learned from the perfect example of what not to do. Last month I ran into Kevin, my replacement, at a conference. He'd lasted 9 months before Vanguard eliminated his position entirely. They brought in an automated system, he told me. Nobody there understands how it works. They just trust it's handling everything correctly. Do they have someone reviewing executive expenses? I asked. He laughed like I'd made a joke. That function got eliminated too. Why, is that important? I thought about explaining that financial oversight is the difference between a functional company and a criminal enterprise with business cards. But instead I just smiled and said, you'd be surprised how important it can be. 3 weeks ago I got a call from Patricia Montgomery. Vanguard was facing an SEC investigation into executive compensation practices and expense account irregularities. They wanted to know if I'd be willing to provide testimony about policy violations and documentation practices. I said yes. Richard Cosgrove, last I heard, is working at a mid-sized insurance firm in Phoenix, Arizona. He's not CFO. He's assistant controller, making about 60% of what he made at Vanguard, with no expense account and no executive privileges. His LinkedIn profile says he specializes in operational excellence and efficiency optimization. I think about him sometimes. Wonder if he understands what really happened that summer. Wonder if he realizes that cutting my severance to 0 was the single biggest mistake of his career. Wonder if he ever figured out that the woman he dismissed as disposable was the only person standing between him and a complete audit investigation. Probably not. People like Richard never really understand. They think power comes from titles and authority and the ability to override other people's objections. They don't understand that real power comes from documentation, from following policy when everyone else cuts corners, from maintaining an audit trail that can withstand any scrutiny. The lesson isn't about revenge, though I won't lie and say watching Richard lose his job and his bonus wasn't satisfying. The real lesson is simpler: your work has value, your integrity matters, and sometimes the best protection you can have is a comprehensive paper trail showing exactly who followed policy and who violated it. Richard thought he could save money by cutting my severance to 0. What he actually did was trigger an investigation that cost him his job, his bonus, his reputation, and approximately $400,000 in reimbursed expenses. All because I'd spent years documenting every policy violation he thought nobody was tracking. Some people call that karma. I call it proper financial oversight. Thanks for sticking around through this entire story, you magnificent people who understand that documentation is power. If this resonated with you, if you've ever been told your years of service were worthless, if you've ever watched executives violate policy while preaching accountability, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. These workplace justice stories remind us that integrity isn't just a nice idea, it's actually effective. Remember, document everything, follow policy even when others don't, and keep your receipts both literal and metaphorical. The audit trail you build today might be the insurance policy you need tomorrow. Stay vigilant, keep documenting, and never let anyone tell you that following policy is somehow the problem.